Okay. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Data Ethics and Justice session of UC Love Data Week 2022. Before we begin, I want to begin by acknowledging that as a land-grant institution, the library at UCLA acknowledges our presence on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Gabrielino Tongva peoples. So first of all, thank you so much for joining us. My name is Lee Fan, and I am a data scientist at the Data Science Center at UCLA Library. First of all, I want to introduce some of our co-organizers. So I'll just mention them and they can introduce themselves. So you want to go ahead, Ibrahim?
Sure. Yes. So hi, everyone. My name is Ibrahim Ali. I'm the sciences data librarian based in the biomedical library at UCLA. I primarily help people with programming and statistics, especially in R for folks in preclinical and clinical research.
And Erin.
Hi, everyone. I'm Erin Foster. I am the service lead for the Research Data Management program at UC Berkeley. And that program is a partnership between the library and research IT. So I help researchers across disciplines with their data management needs.
Ibrahim and Erin. Ibrahim, could you go to the next slide? All right, so just wanted to go over a quick schedule of what today will look like. So the structure of the workshop or the session is going to be, we're going to have some speaker presentations and we'll quickly introduce the speakers, and then we'll go into their bios right before they present. After the presentations, we'll have discussions and Q&As with the speakers, and then we'll reconvene from the breakout rooms to share the discussions and highlights. Next slide, please. So our speakers today are Nashra Mahmood, who is a PhD candidate in gender studies at UCLA. If you want to unmute and say hello really quick, Nashra.
Hey, everyone. Great to be here.
And we have Marianne Smart from UC San Diego in the computer science department.
Hi, excited to be here.
And lastly, we have Jacob Swoveland from UCLA in statistics.
Hello, nice to see you.
Thanks, you all. So before we begin or move forward, Ibrahim, could you go to the next slide? Just a few notes. We want to highlight that the purpose and the goal of this discussion is to foster conversation around addressing and taking action on issues of data ethics and justice in the UC research community. And we also want to highlight that there's no experience necessary. We acknowledge that this topic may be new to a lot of people, and we're all here to learn. So So if you're in the breakout room and you maybe don't feel comfortable yet engaging, it's okay. Come and hang out and listen and learn. So that's what we're encouraging everyone to do. Next slide, please. Oh, maybe that's it, right? Yes. So before that, before we go to our end slide, let's introduce some of the speakers. So one second, let me get. So our first speaker, who I'll introduce, is Nashra Mahmood, who is a fifth year in the gender studies program at UCLA, pursuing their PhD. And they hold a bachelor's in economics and gender studies from Knox College and a master's in gender studies from UCLA. Their undergraduate research focused on feminized labor and unionization in North India's informal economy. Currently, they are studying how media manipulation and communalist and racist disinformation in Indian media post-October 2019 has reconstituted national belonging in India. Please welcome Nashra Mahmood.
Thanks so much, Lee, Ibrahim, and everyone, and Erin. Thank you so much for introducing us and getting this panel together. So I'm just going to share my slides and get started on this presentation. Can everyone see that all right? Okay, awesome. Let me just get the timer on so I don't go over time. Okay, so my presentation today is going to be relaying my experience studying social media and the questions that I've come across in this research process. And before I jump into my methodology, let me provide you with some background on my broader research, sites of analysis, and the socio-political conditions under which I'm undertaking this project. Broadly, my dissertation research is studying how stories, especially the ones that are told by our political leaders on various media, are central to the project of nation building post-2019 in the context of India. So on the night of May 23rd, 2019, in his election victory speech, live telecasted by electronic and social media, Prime Minister Narendra Modi embraced the role of the nation's watchman. He repeatedly spoke of democracy, freedom, and struggle through the trope of the watchman, encouraging his fellow citizens to do the same. Standing on this massive golden platform with his oversized portrait looking directly back at the passionate crowd of his supporters, Modi boasted about how his government had successfully unmasked the fake tag of secularism in India. More importantly, he asserted that every Indian citizen would have to, quote, pledge to transform India into a strong nation, unquote, for the next 5 years. In my research, I seek to answer the following two-tiered question. What role do social media play in reconstituting the meaning of Indianness and belonging? How do vernacular print news media and Modi's monthly radio program addressed to the nation, Man Ki Baat, converse with social media to reify and or resist discursive constructions of Indian nationhood? I focus on the years 2019 to 2020 because they represent a crucial moment in the history of the Indian nation state. This was when ideas of Indian nation were reconstituted with the re-election of Modi as a prime minister. This period was also marked by passage of the Citizenship Amendment Act, which has sought to redefine the relationship between religious affiliation and citizenship. So why Twitter? Prior to the pandemic, this project was actually interested in how alternative news organizations are tackling disinformation in the context of India. And this meant that I was going to be interning at a select few news organizations during my 4th year and studying how the distinctions between truths, facts, and fiction are established in these newsmaking spaces. However, due to the pandemic, I was unable to travel to India. So this called for a major restructuring of my study because one of my data sites, which was one of the central ones, was no longer viable. And I decided to shift my study online. I shifted my focus completely online and was able to do that somewhat easily. I was taking a digital humanities class at the time, and I discovered that I could gather live Twitter data relatively easily. I didn't really have to have a lot of coding experience to do that. So I used tags Google Sheet, which to scrape tweets from a hashtag concerning the Citizenship Amendment Act. And Tags Google Sheet, just for a little bit of background, is a Google Sheets that is created by Michael Hochside, and you can find it very easily on Google. And the Google Sheet accesses the Twitter API via your Twitter account. So for folks who are new to coding or may not have done coding before, this Google Sheets is a really good tool simply because the setup is very easy and requires you to just simply sort of log into your Twitter account and have it connect to the Google Sheets itself. The only caveat is that it can retrieve tweets going back as old as 7 days. And it took me because it worked for me because I was paying attention to Twitter trends and was tracking them live. I was not really interested in getting old tweets. And over the span of approximately 5 months, I had started collecting or scraping tweets in November 2019. I collected approximately 500,000 tweets, and I stopped my Twitter data collection in March of 2020. And I realized I was getting way more information than I had asked for or expected, right? For instance, I was only interested in knowing what kinds of tweets were using hashtags and who was tweeting them. But I also ended up getting user profile location, the number of retweets attached to the tweet itself, the Twitter ID. And I was just struck by how much more data I was able to get. And as a graduate student who was just sort of beginning their data collection, I was elated. I mean, this was a boon, you know, I was able to get so much more data without having to do a lot more work, right? Like I just had to do a bunch of clicks and typing and I could get it very easily. And I didn't really think about the power implications or ethics behind that sort of data collection. It wasn't until really this year, like my 5th year, so 2021, when I started thinking about, I started doing participant observation on Twitter, which is more qualitative and ethnographic in nature. I started reflecting upon my existing Twitter data set and the question that I had for myself, and I still am unable to sort of come up with a concrete answer, is that how public is social media data, right? So here I'm indebted to internet and social media scholars such as Christian Fuchs, Matthew Williams, and Milia Z. Bailey, who have not only written extensively, but also offered us models on how to conduct social media research in an ethical and transparent manner, especially when working with vulnerable communities or online hate groups, right? Their scholarship has served as a guide for my own work, as they have alerted me to pay attention to how within social media research, there is a lack of conversation around ethics and transparency. And questions about ethical conduct when we're sort of conducting or dealing with social media research, it's a tedious and arduous task. And like no one really wants to really think about it, but I think it's important that we think about it, regardless of how tedious it may seem. Okay, so the existing scholarship on how to conduct ethical research has identified the following 3 areas that I think we should reflect upon. Commercialism. Twitter is a public platform that is driven by commercial interest. Like we should, just like Google, because Google is an advertising platform, even though we think of it as a search engine, it is primarily, if we think about it as an advertising platform, the kind of searches that we're getting back might not be the best. So in the same vein, Twitter is also a public platform, but it is driven by commercial interests. Their guidelines on privacy should not be a starting point for researchers and academics. Instead, us researchers should think about how the implications behind quoting a tweet verbatim in our study, even if it is coming from a relatively unknown or small Twitter account, has pretty big consequences or implications down the line. This question about public data, even if we're saying that Twitter is a public platform, does not mean that its users are aware or even on board with how their tweets are going to be used outside of the platform. Just by stating that a data set is public does not mean that its contents are always public, especially if the information that you have collected about a set of people have not consented to you using their words for research purposes. And lastly, anytime you use social media data for academic purposes, it always has the potential to release sensitive information about people. And this goes with not just social media research, but any kind of research if you're dealing with human subject data, right? And what I mean by that is if we need to sort of consider what constitutes as sensitive personal information in the context of social media research. What I, as a researcher, consider to be sensitive information may be totally different or at odds with what the user who make up my data set consider to be sensitive information, right? So how do we end up dealing with such big questions surrounding privacy of our users? And how do we ethically go about conducting research using social media data? So the scholarship on internet research ethics suggests that we create context-specific ethical frameworks for our research methodologies. And to do so, we can implement a 3-step process. The first 2 steps are research-driven. They involve us reading up on existing models of ethical research, and also getting acquainted with data privacy laws from the region you're conducting your research from. The last step is to create a model of your own that is specifically applicable to your own research context. And in the next slides, 3 slides, I'm going to give you a brief rundown of my own clunky sort of ethical framework that I came up with in the context of my own research. So since I work with both vulnerable groups and online hate groups, it was imperative that I came up with a way to not only protect privacy of my users, but also my own self. And here I read up on Association of Internet Researchers' latest installment of ethical guidelines, UCLA IRB's guidelines on how to conduct internet research. I also relied on guidelines produced by the American Anthropological Association and Data and Society. Specifically, there are sections on how to conduct risky research, especially if you're sort of working with alt-right groups or supremacist groups, right? The next thing that I moved on to think about was I read up on data privacy laws for California and India, so I could learn about what I could or could not publish. Moreover, reading up on data privacy laws is a really good way to decide, in my opinion, what makes up sensitive personal information in the context of my own research. Especially if you have a large data set and you don't have the ability to go ahead and sort of converse with each and individual Twitter user that you have in your data set, right? So sensitive personal information usually has to do with race, ethnicity, age, place of residence, telephone numbers, the person's name. But in the context of social media research, we don't have the same kind of data. We still have sensitive personal information, but it might not look like names. It might, for instance, in my research, I'm considering usernames and profile images to be sensitive personal information. Okay. So based on my research, I came up with the conclusion that I should submit an IRB for my study, which I don't think everyone would be on board with, but this is just sort of my conclusion, because I am working with quote unquote big data, where tweets and accompanying metadata can be easily classified as data collected from humans, albeit algorithmically or computationally, right? And upon reading through existing guidelines that I sort of cited in the previous slides, I came up with the conclusion that I should seek informed consent for tweets that I plan to quote verbatim. Otherwise, I will have to paraphrase them. The other task is to depersonalize or anonymize my Twitter data set using open source tools. So OpenRefine and ARX is another open source tool that can sort of help you if you have a big Twitter data set to go about depersonalizing it. I also came across this risk assessment chart that was produced by Matthew Williams on a data journalism website, where he has sort of offered us a guide on what data can be published from Twitter and what can't be, depending on the publicness of the Twitter user, right? And in conclusion, the intention of my presentation today was to really start a conversation amongst emerging social media researchers and others who may be interested in working with Twitter data. I don't have clear answers, I just have more questions. And I hope you found this presentation to be helpful, and I'm looking forward to talking about it in more detail with you all. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you so much, Nashra. That was a great presentation, and I just want to add, while we're kind of in between, that we're going to take questions in the breakout rooms later or at the end. So please keep in mind the questions you have or thoughts you have. So now I'm going to hand the mic to Erin to introduce the next speaker.
So I am pleased to introduce Jacob Swovlin, who has received his Bachelor's of Statistics at the University of California, Riverside in 2019. Following his graduation, Jacob spent 2 years working in medical billing and information security. Hopefully people could hear me okay, because I just realized I didn't put my mic down. So Jacob spent 2 years working in medical billing and information security at Epic Health Systems in Verona, Wisconsin. And he is currently working on a Master's of Statistics at the University of California, Los Angeles. So Jacob, I will hand it over to you.
Amazing. Thanks for the introduction. Let's see. So my name's Jacob. I'm here to talk to you today about data protection and communication. My background, as was mentioned, is in medicine and trying to protect that kind of data. So an interesting question, why should you care about protecting your data? It's probably so baseline, you just feel the answer is obvious, but I always like to ask it too. As you do your research, you find that data is actually really valuable. So valuable, in fact, that people kind of want to steal it. And when they do, bad things happen. That kind of damage can happen immediately or anytime in the future. As you've ever heard of someone, losing someone else's social security number, and then years later their lives and finances or their reputations just ruined. So it really matters a lot to be protecting these kinds of things. Last year was a pretty bad year in terms of cyber crimes. Something like more than 40 million records were stolen. Medical records were stolen, and there's more than 600 cyber attacks against just hospitals last year. It was overall, I think it was the worst year in terms of damage. I could keep talking to you about how cybercrime is on the rise and really dangerous, how you should be afraid, but I'd rather talk about a story instead, since that's kind of hard to visualize why we should be worried about such a thing. So there have been times when a hospital is attacked and they end up having to publish a story about it, and I want to tell you a little bit about one in Vermont that happened in 2020. The University of Vermont Medical Center ended up waking up one day in late October and found out they had been a victim of a cyber attack. It was a very complete cyber attack, and it was really scary because essentially their entire computer system was destroyed. Every single one of their computers got infected. And, some of the patients have really complex cases like cancer patients do. And what happened was the doctors ended up opening up their laptops that day and saying, we have to administer our treatment to these patients, but we have no idea what it is. They get scared. They can't treat these patients, have to turn them away, especially something like cancer, where that kind of rigorous treatment on a schedule is very important. I always like to mention to people, if you think you're safe because your goal is noble, or you think you're too small of a fry to be a target, then you're probably wrong, because, these hospitals have been fighting coronavirus, especially back in 2020 when it was first newer, and yet they're still a target. So I don't feel like anyone is so low as to think your goal is so noble that you won't be attacked at all ever. So it's important to defend yourself. However, in the story, there was some really good silver lining. They found a lot of best practices around, so much so that none of their really valuable information, like their protective health information or PII, person identifiable information, was stolen, which is shocking, actually. Imagine a burglar coming to rob your house, essentially. They didn't come to rob your house to kick down your door or break your windows or make a mess of your apartment. They came to steal the valuable stuff, your money, your jewelry locked up in the safe. But in this case, they ended up blowing up the entire house, but they couldn't open the safe, so they didn't really get much out of it, which is probably the best case scenario happening in that scenario. Luckily, a month after their attack, they ended up rebuilding their computer system from the ground up, essentially. Then they went back to work, which is really nice for those patients. But maybe you don't work for one of those organizations, but how do you fit in, even as like an individual researcher? Or maybe you do work for one of those organizations. Generally, I think of like data protection and two teams kind of working with each other. There's the back end team, and then there's a front end team. So the back end team is controlling your servers and best practices and such, and they usually keep up with security terms. But you typically deal with data and other things. So you're more on the front end team, where you actually just do a lot of that work. And you are really important in keeping data safe, because most of these attacks that are happening are against you, since it's so much easier to attack you instead of someone else. So what can you do? Or like, what can we learn from this story? It's really important to follow best practices when communicating and with encrypting data, because that's how you make sure that when someone breaks into your house, that they can't figure out how to steal your valuable stuff. If I have an email with all of the data that I have, but it's encrypted, and they break into my email, they can't really read it, and I only care about them not reading it instead of just reading a bunch of my other unencrypted emails instead that don't really matter. And when you go to share your data, make sure that you understand who you're sharing it with, since not everyone has the best intentions, and have a really good way of passing off that data. Make sure you have a good system essentially, and follow other good practices, like having a password manager to make sure you're not doubling up on your passwords, or making sure you have some kind of multi-factor authentication in place, like your phone or like a Face ID, just to make sure that if someone does steal your password, that they're probably gonna steal everything as well. Just keep in mind that when you're protecting your data, keep it safe, because people really depend on you. And hopefully I'll get to see you in the breakout room to discuss about it a little bit more.
Great. Thank you, Jacob, so much. And then I will pass it off to Ibrahim to introduce our last speaker.
Thank you, Aaron. And awesome talk. Nasha and Jacob, really appreciate that. So I have the pleasure of introducing Marianne Smart, who is a computer science PhD student at UC San Diego studying human-computer interaction. In her work, she investigates ways to improve privacy communication with non-expert users of technology, and explores how people think about data privacy issues. During the winter of 2022, she's working as a visiting researcher at Columbia University. So we're very excited to have her join us. And I will pass the mic over to Marianne.
All right. Hi, everyone. I'm Marianne, and today I'm going to be talking about the limitations of consent for ethical data collection. So there are three problems that I want to talk about today. The first is that while consent is supposed to be freely given, in practice, unfortunately, that isn't always the case. The second problem is that in some situations, it can be difficult to get truly meaningful informed consent. And finally, the third problem is that individual consent might not make the most sense in situations where the data being collected pertains to a larger group. Okay, so the first problem, coerced consent. There are a number of reasons that someone might feel pressured to share their data or to participate in research. For example, in her book, Automating Inequality, Virginia Eubanks talks about how people living in poverty are often pressured to share personal information in order to be able to access essential services. So for example, she talks about the coordinated entry system in Los Angeles. So the way the system works is that unhoused people in San Diego, Los Angeles, have to share really sensitive information, including medical histories and possibly drug abuse history or psychiatric history, in order to get a shot at accessing supportive housing resources. So this is a great book. I encourage people to check it out, but I actually want to shift focus to something that came up in my own research. So I was doing an online survey study, and I was recruiting participants through Qualtrics. So Qualtrics has a number of different pools from which they recruit participants. And in this study, I was trying to understand the different factors that influence how people decide whether or not to share their browsing history data. So that's a particularly sensitive kind of data because it can reveal a lot about you. So in this survey, we asked a number of questions, including the question, would you be willing to share your browsing history data with us? And then we asked why or why not. And we noticed a few kind of strange responses where people were basically saying, yes, we're willing to share because we need the money. So like, these are real responses from the survey. I need money badly, so it's worth the weird risk. And we realized that people had interpreted our survey to mean that they had to share this sensitive information with us in order to participate in the study and receive payment at the end of the survey. That wasn't at all what we intended, and we went in and we corrected the wording. But I think this is coming from some of the issues with these online platforms that are used for survey research. The people who make a living or make money on the side by filling out surveys on these platforms often get treated unfairly, and they don't always have recourse for addressing unfair treatment. So what I've taken away from this is if you're going to use these kinds of platforms for online survey research, it's important to be aware of the power dynamics involved. And it's really important, I mean, that's true really of all research, but especially here. And it's important to be really clear about what is and is not required for participants to participate in the study and to get paid at the end. Okay, so the next problem I want to talk about is this problem with informed consent. So these are two XKCD comics that are kind of making fun of privacy policies and these other very legalistic, difficult to read documents that we often run into online or when we're trying to use software on our computers. So the idea is that these kinds of documents can help us make informed decisions about how we navigate the internet or how we share different kinds of information. But in practice, these kinds of policies tend to not be very effective. They're difficult to read, and they often sort of bury key information deep down in the policy where no one actually, reads to. So for example, this privacy policy and this XKCD comic, they've buried the line, by using this service, you opt in to quartering troops in your home. Now, obviously, that's kind of an extreme example, but these privacy policies do have a lot of problems. But even beyond that, even assuming that you find some good way to communicate with people about privacy risks, there's this additional problem that is sort of specific to the age of modern data analytics. So I'll go ahead and read this quote. Suppose a person gives out an innocuous piece of data at one point in time, thinking that he or she is not revealing anything sensitive. At other points in time, the person reveals equally non-sensitive data. Unexpectedly, this data might be combined and analyzed to reveal sensitive facts about the person. The person never disclosed these facts, nor anticipated that they would be uncovered. The problem is that the person gave away too many clues. Modern data analytics can deduce extensive information about a person from these clues. In other words, little bits of innocuous data can say a lot in combination. So what does this have to do with informed consent? Basically, the issue is that it's really hard to determine what the risk is in a particular information sharing decision because we don't know how that data might be aggregated with other sources of data, how it might be used to infer, things that we didn't decide to share. And so that's this additional wrinkle in the problem of informed consent, that it's just very hard to reason about privacy risks in this era of modern data analytics. Okay, and the final problem that I want to talk about is this problem of individual consent for collective data. The easiest example of this to understand is genetic data. So imagine that I'm thinking of sharing my genetic information with a research group or a company like 23andMe or something. Now, my genetic information is going to reveal a lot about my parents and my brother. And so my sharing that information potentially poses some privacy risks to them. So there's this question, does it really make sense that only my consent is needed to share this data, given that risk is going to also be posed to these other people in my family? But this applies outside of just the realm of genetic information. This applies on social media as well. So a simple example would be if I share a picture on Facebook of me and a friend, technically that's my data. It's a photo that I took, I shared, it's on my account, but it's also revealing something about my friend. And we can go kind of a layer deeper here. Maybe I chose not to share on my Facebook account that I work at UC San Diego. But if all of my friends have shared that they work at UC San Diego and Facebook has this sort of understanding of my social network, it wouldn't be very difficult to infer that I also work at UC San Diego. So my friends' data sharing decisions are influencing me potentially. So this is related to an ongoing research project where we're trying to build an interface that will sort of surface these issues so that end users can reason about this nature of this interconnectedness of privacy concerns. And what we're trying to expose is the kinds of inferences that Facebook might be able to make about a friend based on information that you've shared and information about the social network. So the sort of main question we're trying to understand in this project is, does learning about how their information sharing might affect other people change participants' attitudes towards information sharing on Facebook? Okay, so finally, I've posed a lot of questions here. Unfortunately, I don't have an easy, one-size-fits-all solution to these problems. I think the right answer is just very much going to depend on the context, right? But if you're interested in thinking about this further, I am certainly not the first person to critique the idea of consent. So these are some additional resources that you might find helpful in thinking about this further. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Marianne, and thanks for providing further reading and recommendations. That just reminded me that there's a document that some of us are contributing to add resources related to data ethics and data justice. So maybe we can send that out after the workshop. Cool. So I just want to say thank you so much to all of the speakers and for presenting their research and being willing to share your work with us. I've learned so much from you in the past couple months and just like seeing your research presentations again. All right, so like we mentioned before, we're going to go into discussions and it's fairly open-ended. I think some of the presenters have some interactive activities for folks. So we're going to do that and until 2:05, and then we're going to come back and just, we actually also have a shared notes document. I have the link. Do you have it handy, Ibrahim? There we go. So we have a shared notes document that everyone should have access to. So feel free to add notes to it or questions about anything you had during the presentations or questions you have during the breakout rooms, and we can just keep it all together and share ideas. All right, so now we're going to go into those sessions, and we'll come back at about 2:05, and then after that we're going to share and then wrap up from there. All right, so oh wait, Erin,
sorry, I was just going to clarify that for anyone, if you should be able via the breakout room button on the bottom to join whichever room you would like. So feel free to do that. And if you run into any trouble, I think Lee, myself, or Ibrahim will be able to push you into a room. But yes, what Lee said, we can plan on meeting in there and see you all a little after 2.
Yeah, and as you might be able to see this, that the breakout rooms are named after the presenters. So if you were interested in a specific presenter's topic, you can join that specific group. And each of us, Ibrahim, Erin, and I will be in one of those. So we'll see you all there.
I'll hang back in the main session just for a little bit to make sure that we have, everyone going to the sessions, and then I'll, pop back and forth if we have any randoms admitted into the
We just want to
session.
have discussions. Yeah.
Yeah.
I will also go ahead and stop recording soon too.
Great.
Cool.
All right. See you real soon.
All right.
Yep.
See you.